Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit the German slip stitch selvage. This technique is all about adding smoother and neater selvages to your flat knitting projects, and I'll be demonstrating on both garter stitch and stockinette stitch. As you can see, I've already cast on some stitches and knitted a few rows of garter stitch. Garter stitch is made up of only knit stitches, and you can see that the edges are quite bumpy. These side edges are what we also call selvages. I've knitted this section just to act as a comparison. Okay, so for every right side row, which represents the front of your knitting, you're going to begin with one knit stitch. So make sure the working yarn is at the back and do one knit stitch. This method only involves the first stitch and the last stitch on every row. What's in between these two stitches is entirely up to you. You can knit any pattern at all. Since I'm knitting garter stitch, I'm now just going to do knit stitches until I've only got one stitch left. Then for the selvage stitch at the end of every right side row, you'll need to slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. What this means is that you first need to make sure that the working yarn is at the back behind the needles. Then to slip a stitch purlwise, you take the right hand needle down through the next stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling, you just slip that stitch off the end of the needle, like so. So to recap, on right side rows you begin with one knit stitch and you finish by slipping a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. You'll notice that when you turn the knitting round now, the working yarn leaves from the second stitch down rather than the top stitch. This might seem unusual, but this is how it's supposed to look. Then, for wrong side rows, which represent the back of your knitting, you need to begin with one purl stitch. So make sure the working yarn is at the front of the needles towards you, and purl a stitch. Then you can do any pattern you like until you reach the last stitch. Because I'm doing garter stitch, I'm just going to do knit stitches. Then you need to slip the very last stitch purlwise, but this time with the yarn in front. So make sure that the working yarn is in front of the needles towards you. Then take the right hand needle down through the next stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling, you just slip that stitch off the end of the needle. So to recap, for every wrong side row, you need to purl the first stitch, and you need to slip the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. You should now already be able to see that the knitting has narrowed slightly where we've added the selvages. This is because, even though we haven't changed the overall number of stitches on the needles, the selvages that we've added smoothen and streamline the garter stitch. The reason I wanted to demonstrate garter stitch first is that the difference is very marked. Whereas the regular garter stitch edges are quite bumpy, the selvages that we've added are nice and neat and smooth. The slip stitches that we used are relatively long, and these give an elegant, elongated appearance. I'm now going to demonstrate how to add these selvages to stockinette stitch. So of course we start with one knit stitch, and I continue with knit stitches because we're doing stockinette stitch. And then for the last stitch, I slip one purlwise with the yarn in back. Then on the wrong side rows, I start with a purl stitch. And because I'm doing stockinette stitch, I then do purl stitches until I get to the last stitch. And then I slip one purlwise with the yarn in front. And here you can see I've done a few more rows for a better comparison. You'll notice that where the garter stitch narrowed when you added the selvages, here the knitting hasn't really narrowed at all. If we take a closer look now, you'll be able to see that the selvages we've added are actually fairly similar to the selvages of regular stockinette stitch. The only difference really is that the selvages that we've added are made up of longer stitches. I think this makes the selvages we've added look a lot more elegant and neat. I really hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.